Hello, my name is Mary Gray, and I'm a senior principal researcher at Microsoft Research. Thank you for joining me for this plenary talk, Our Oppenheimer Moment, when Big Tech, Research Ethics, and Human Rights Collide. I'd like to begin the talk by framing it with a quote from Robert Oppenheimer, "I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." Oppenheimer made this statement 20 years after the detonation of the first atom bomb. He spent the rest of his life lobbying for the removal of nuclear weapons, the weapons that he had created. Most of his life's work was pursuing the question, what are the responsibilities of scientists to society? For today's talk, I'd like to take you on a road trip, rethinking what are the definitions of science, and particularly technologies and sciences coming together into a new world of transdisciplinary sciences. What are the social failures that come from collisions of tech sciences, big tech companies, and human rights colliding? And what are some lessons we can learn from the past? Moments when science had to come to grips with its methods and its new ideas failing society. And then lastly, hopefully, I'll have some recommendations for how we could diffuse the future of a tech world where the sciences are constantly interacting with society and its needs. So a few definitions. I want to note that back when I started my research, the internet looked mostly like this. It was a laundry list of websites, many dead links, lots of new opportunities for sharing information, but also the burgeoning of social connections, people finding each other online, learning how to ask questions of each other, to exchange information, but mostly just living their lives. Most of my research, which is focused on young people in rural parts of the United States coming out online, and a world of online contract labor circulating the globe, has brought thorny questions to my institutional review boards. Mostly, I'm asking questions that are somewhat familiar, but are embarking on different methodologies that are less known. They have to do with engaging these digital social worlds that distribute us, but at the same time connect us deeply. So my research ethics have had to stretch as I've rethought my questions, and most importantly, had to think about new methodologies. The core argument I have for you today is that new questions and new methods strain our ethics. They produce ethical dilemmas that constantly force us to rethink what are the ethical considerations that come with the work that I'm doing. Now, in the late 1990s, tech research, and by tech research, I mean computer science, engineering, but also social sciences and new forms of science, computational science, started to think about how they could look to the internet and look to this digital world to ask new questions. And they had some new methodologies. They could mine or clean what's called pre-existing data sets, surveys that perhaps somebody put online, or even the kind of loosely structured data you might find from a website like OkCupid. You could scrape websites, meaning you could go to Twitter and with some pretty cool coding and tooling, pick up many of the comments that were publicly available. You could also buy more structured data as more people started to produce vestiges and traces of their online exchanges. And you could mine telemetry data. You could look at everything from a mouse scroll to a keyboard click to see what kinds of new information might point to human behavior, social exchange. These are all fantastic sources of data. But along the way in the 1990s, we didn't notice how much of the internet was changing. And so more and more of the information we were finding online looked like a backyard barbecue. We were A/B testing in real time, trying to see what happens when we perhaps changed a feature or put new information online. But we were also merging previously disconnected data sets, creating enhanced data sets that meant we could now correlate everything from survey data to what somebody might have chosen for a breakfast that morning. And lastly, we've created new data sets. We're interacting with people. We're asking them to look at the data they produce, perhaps the advertisements they consume or the messages they left friends, and having them annotate this data. And for anybody following the world of artificial intelligence, particularly in domains of health, anywhere where we're looking to personalize artificial intelligence, most of what we have to build is going to hinge on being able to understand not just what data is there, but why people made the decisions they made. And that means even more and more interactions with people to understand the data that they're producing. So there's no evidence that we're going to be leaving this very social world of data. So what's changed for tech research? Researchers like me, and particularly my colleagues in computer science and engineering? Well, the answer is that many of us are now asking deeply social questions, not just behavioral questions, but social questions about the dynamics of how people interact online. What do they share? How does that sharing affect the way they see the world, the way they understand the world? That means we're not just experimenting in a closed world, in a closed lab. We're literally experimenting in an open world. And then secondly, we're creating new methods to do the job. We can follow everything from a tweet that's crisscrossing the world around different social media sites to being able to look at the most intimate exchanges if they're available to us as researchers. Then lastly, we're analyzing what is effectively not just individual data traces, but these exchanges, these interactions. The interactions are actually the most interesting part of this new online social world. But what's missing? Arguably, tech research has never updated its ethics. So we have a whole new set of questions studying society at scale, and we have a whole new set of methodologies. But we have yet to really ask, what are the new ethical considerations that come with this advancement in science? We're analyzing existing data sets, and we're making a lot of assumptions that as long as it's de-identified, it's available for the taking. And we're studying people. Even though they seem extracted from data and alien or distanced from us, at the end of the day, we are quite literally watching the equivalent of the public park, so familiar to sociologists, or the religious house, so familiar to anthropologists. So I want to move to talk about a very spotty but rich world of collisions that we could call social failures, places where tech has upended social expectations of both what we know, but more importantly, what we're studying, what we're building. And so in the next section, I'd like to closely dissect a recent collision of tech research, human rights, and research ethics. So in this next section, I'd like to dissect a collision of tech, research ethics, and human rights. I want to offer a postmortem of the 2014 Facebook Contagion study. Now, I offer this analysis in some ways because it doesn't seem so threatening. It isn't a terrible case of a meltdown because of tech research, but it is a case that shows us the fault lines of where society has issue with both the questions we're asking, but as importantly, how we're asking them. In the case of the Facebook Contagion study, we had 3 different authors, 2 of them based at a university setting, and 1 of them at a company. And importantly, the research that was being done was designed by all 3 of the researchers. The research data was collected by 1 of the researchers, but all 3 were involved in writing what has now become a very well-known Proceedings of the National Academies of Science paper. So let's look at the research question. In an experiment with people who use Facebook, we test whether emotional contagion occurs outside of in-person interaction between individuals by reducing the amount of emotional content in the newsfeed. As you can see, this research design has two treatments: reduction in the positive and negative post and news feeds. It was collected over a week in 2012. It selected nearly 700,000 pieces of data, the news feeds of users on Facebook. The consent was effectively terms of service, although at the time the terms of service did not include being able to use the newsfeed for research. And there was no debriefing after the experiment. Now, anyone familiar with human subjects research knows that when you perturb humans, when you're experimenting, when you're interacting with them, there's an expectation that you're going to ask for their permission. And if you don't ask for their permission, which is acceptable if the science might be undone by seeking consent, you do need to make sure you debrief the people involved to let them know that they were part of research. And in all cases, you're asked to evaluate what are the risks to participants. In this case, there was no human subjects ethics review for the research. And it would have been a matter of course for psychology studies like this. So wait, research that's looking at a foundational question in the sciences, trying to understand the social impact of social media on our emotional well-being, didn't have a review? So in the Facebook studies case, who's accountable for tracking people's best interests? Well, importantly, Cornell University pushed back on any claims that it was responsible. After all, it was just looking at de-identified pre-existing data that was handed to its researchers by Facebook. And it argued that in many ways, the responsibility really hinged on the question of de-identified data. If it's de-identified, it's really not their purview as a university institution. So the internet searched its soul, and it was asking, is this ethical computer science and engineering research? Does this tech research warrant social discussion? There were an overwhelming number, in fact, nearly 30,000 responses on just one day in June to the coverage of the Facebook Contagion study. Even though the Facebook Contagion study seems like a simple example of perhaps bad marketing or failing to really think about how to frame the study, I would argue it shares something in common with past collisions of tech, research ethics, and human rights. So let's rethink a past collision as an example to compare to this current social failure. The case of the Middle Miss study, also a psychology study, also foundational research. It's asking a really important question. And think about the timing of Middle Miss, 1976. It's in the thick of intercultural turmoil globally. The Vietnam War has raised so much pain and wounding. And we're asking ourselves in the United States, what does it mean to engage with different cultures, to understand differences across cultures in terms of how we hold our bodies, how we exchange greetings? So it was asking a fascinating research question. Does stranger proximity, how we're standing next to each other, affect our physiology? So that's a really fascinating question that comes with the times. There's a new method that's brought to bear to ask this question. The researchers decided, let's look at a public urinal, send in research assistants, and measure how men react to other men, strangers, standing next to them, especially if they scoot a little closer to them. And the new technology was telescopic lenses. So research assistants bored holes in the bathroom stalls and were able to capture the urination stream of men at a urinal without interacting with them, without knowing their identities, without ever having to exchange a word. And they measured time to urinate as a way of capturing the amount of tension in a person's body when they're standing next to someone? Now, again, this is a fascinating research question. And I think most of us thinking back on Middle Mist can see why it created such upheaval, such social outcry. Certainly the timing had a lot to do with it, and I'm going to come back to that point. But what I want you to note are the commonalities between the case of Facebook and the case of Middle Mist. In both cases, the researchers were data-centric. You could say rapacious. They were not interested in the data provenance. In the case of Facebook Contagion study, over 800,000 users had their news feeds mined for insights. And the identities of those users was considered relevant as long as it was de-identified information. So if you can access the data, it's yours as a researcher. And in the Middle Mist case, the same applied. The data was the most important piece of the puzzle. And considering what might be dignified to the people who were generating those insights was not even a second thought. Secondly, in both cases, the researchers didn't have training in how to think about creating data sets that recognize the humanity of the people, of the groups who are generating those insights. And in fact, they were not seen as stakeholders who had any rights to the matter. The researchers were using inferences to gauge whether people would or wouldn't want to share their information to keep objective distance. And in both Middle Mist and in Facebook Contagion study, they hoped that no one would really ever know if they were involved. So what can we learn? Some key lessons in comparing the Facebook Contagion study and Middle Mist are, first of all, that novel methods will always introduce ethical challenges. In every case, when we are stretching our methods, we have to apply them with care. We have to rethink what are the ethical considerations that should be in place, and most importantly, what might be fractured as we are applying these new methods, what might undo the trust that's been brokered through past research. Secondly, we have to note that science always poses risks to people outside of our data sets. Every time we do our work, there will be conversation about how we did the research. And that means that every group that might be a future participant or respondent or subject in our work will be thinking, how will I be treated? They aren't just individuals producing insights. They are part of communities and social groups that have identities. And they're particularly aware of whether they're being respected or disparaged or not considered at all. And then lastly, using people for research without explaining or asking their permission undermines the public's trust in science. We can't afford to erode that trust. And in fact, we have to build up that trust moving forward. So as you might have guessed, Middle Mist is really a stand-in for other cases of far more horrendous, egregious fractures of public trust. It wasn't until the moments after Middle Mist that we fully took in that science can't use the utilitarian logic to move forward. And in fact, the results of studying the cases of Middle Mist, Tuskegee, Willowbrook were to put a new set of principles in front of researchers that required to keep three principles not in rank order, but in harmony. To be able to hold respect, justice, beneficence in a careful tension, so that at the time, biomedical, behavioral, social sciences could shift to rebuilding the public's trust. But something that we might not notice when we think about those principles is that they also prompt research practices. So in all cases, respect is effectively asking, where did your data come from? Under what agreement? Did people have an opportunity to say, I want to be a part of science, I want to contribute? Or were they unwittingly recruited? And what are the plans for communicating the findings of your work? Justice is a stand-in for a really important question, which is, how are you sampling? Who is included in your sample? How are you caring for those who might be vulnerable? And is there a conflict of interest in your research question? Are you asking something that may benefit you as a researcher, but potentially diminish someone who's contributing data to your data set? And beneficence is in many ways a calculus of risks and benefits. It's asking us to think through who will benefit and who will carry the risk, and what are our obligations to mitigate and balance those benefits and risks. Now, these principles take on different practices in different disciplines, and the moment we're in now forces us to think, as we see computation and computer science and engineering work its way through different humanistic social sciences, biomedical sciences, and in many ways bring us together to this interdisciplinary moment of computation being so thoroughly brought to the table, either as a method or as a set of lenses for new questions. We have to ask, what's missing? So what's missing? Arguably a fourth tenet. I call it mutuality. This tenet would allow us to rethink our agendas in a moment where tech studies, computer science, engineering, computational social sciences, biomedical sciences that are coming together, this new interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary inquiry that hinges on looking at online data and takes on large data sets as its material for thinking, could be approaching the public, groups of people, individuals, to find shared ground, to set shared agendas. And at the very least, seeking oversight so that we aren't asking questions that may be in conflict with the public's needs. And secondly, this tenet of mutuality could be a set of practices around engaging stakeholders and seeing stakeholders as domain experts. This is the heart of Ruha Benjamin's work in Race After Technology, and it presses us to recognize that as scientists, asking social questions at scale, we're often in over our heads, and we need to turn to the domain expertise of the groups that may be on the edges of our data sets or may be hidden in the thick of them. But at the very least, to be able to see that in many cases, our best interlocutors are the people who are going to benefit and carry the risks of what we're doing. A form of participatory research that assumes you will get higher quality data and get better science if you engage the people you're learning from. So let me turn to an example of applying mutuality in science. And I want to talk about it in terms of COVID-19 and some research I've been doing since March with the Pandemic Response Network. If you take the case of digital contact tracing, it's an example of tech research setting an agenda and seeing that a way forward in fighting COVID would be to protect individuals, equip them with information that helps them avoid who might be sick. But it turns out in fighting a pandemic that the most important scientific question is to ask, how do you build trust so that you can help care for who is sick rather than avoid who is sick? So the Pandemic Response Network out of Duke Health has worked with Cure Americas and a number of community-based organizations to use very light touches of technology to equip community healthcare workers. Our work together in North Carolina is a proof of concept of what it looks like to turn to community groups and ask them, what are your needs? How could we equip you to be the ones who collect the public health data we need, and at the same time, listen closely to the fears and concerns of people who are sick, to be able to route them patient support, to be able to provide ongoing care. The key takeaways of looking at cases where we have failed to recognize the needs of society and to learn from the possibilities of applying this principle of mutuality suggests that the future of particularly artificial intelligence are going to hinge on deeper engagement with people. Put in basic terms, most of the data we need to train where we go next will depend on understanding the decisions that people are making. There isn't a world of moving forward in a kind of high quality artificial intelligence without interacting with people. Secondly, this new world of a transdisciplinary tech science that brings all of the sciences together to get socially relevant data, it'll require new research practices, not new ethics. Perhaps adding mutuality as a tenant is in some ways fulfilling the promise of the Belmont Report. But what we need to attend to are the methods we are putting in place and constantly reflecting on what's our flight plan? What do we plan to do with these new tools as we ask slightly different questions? And how are we going to keep accountable to the people and more broadly to society as we learn from them and as we build technologies responding to them? And third, when innovation hinges on studying people and their data, we have federal ethics guidelines that are non-negotiable. So what would it look like to turn to those same guidelines and refresh and renew our commitment to them to help prevent bigger and bigger social fails? And lastly, and perhaps most importantly, it's accepting that there is no removal of harms from the world of science. Science's pact is to minimize risk and to maximize benefit. There is no world of science where we can promise we will do no harm. It's inherently risky, and we have to be honest about that risk. And being honest about that risk means being in deeper conversation with society and assuming that we can build out how we explain what we're doing to warrant their trust. So, how are we going to hold computer science and engineering accountable to society? How are we going to hold this new transdisciplinary world of sciences that hinge on computation and engineering accountable? We can't control the impact of what we create after we create it. There is no world in which we put technologies back in a box or ban them once they're built. So it means we have to control how we conduct our research. And most importantly, we have to bring our conversations with each other to the table and bring society to that discussion. We can no longer assume that our individual intentions are going to win out. It is a culture of research that defines its ethics. So our questions, can we build this, which is a common question among technologists, have to be erased, have to be replaced with, should we build this? And if so, how? To ask that question means engaging stakeholders beyond ourselves, those domain experts who are living their lives and will be impacted by what we build. They will help us decide if we should build this. Secondly, our methods. We have to ask ourselves, how do we treat those involved? And we have to be able to ask that question with the people we're involving. So I have 4 not so modest recommendations for defusing our Oppenheimer moment. First, we could use the common role when we interact with people to build stuff. As noted in the analysis of the Facebook Contagion study, there was no oversight that bridged the gap between university-based research and industry-based research. That has to change. We could require tech research to play by the same rules as the rest of science today. Secondly, we could require human subjects research training for researchers working with people and people's data to help us shift from being data obsessed to people focused. And that means all of us learning that at the end of the day, our data is a proxy for social relationships. In most cases, fairly intimate social exchanges that none of us had any idea would be reused for scientific insight. In most cases, people are happy to give us those insights for science when we ask them for them. And they find it unsettling to find out that their exchanges have been the fodder for science. The third recommendation is to implement a protocol of peer review for ethical practices, for methodologies throughout the computer science and engineering pipeline, and particularly as it connects to other disciplines. And what I mean by this is that today, peer review is considered completed at, say, a full board or an expedited level review in an institutional setting. But what we could be doing is embedding our peer review early in our discussions, in our departments, among our graduate students, and legitimately start talking about our methodologies with another set of questions that runs alongside not how effectively can we get a particular measurement, but always asking, and how will that affect the people who will be generating these insights? How will that change the data sampling? How will I know the data provenance? And is this an agenda that's shared by the people I hope to help? And lastly, we could require people's consent, or at the very least, debriefing as a default rather than an exception. We have to stop letting de-identification stand in for ethics. And I want to linger on this last point a moment. Right now, our federal guidelines around the use of pre-existing data sets effectively say it's not human subjects research if it's de-identified data. The reality that we face every time we see a data breach is that once we are exchanging information online, many of us are identifiable, not because of what's in that one data set, but because how easy it is to correlate different data sets to re-identify who is in the data set we're examining. Case in point, the US Census for 2020 is no longer using de-identified data to share with researchers. They're using a sophisticated privacy-preserving tactic. They're using a sophisticated privacy-preserving strategy called differential privacy, precisely because they no longer have faith in de-identification as a way of protecting people's identity. The rest of science has to accept the reality that we cannot handle data as de-identified, that we have to start handling it as something always leaving the person who generated that insight both at risk and at benefit of being known. So let me return to Oppenheimer. He was asking, what are the responsibilities of scientists to society? What we could be asking, how will computer science and engineering and the sciences that are now coming together in bioengineering, biomedical sciences, humanistic social sciences, the humanities, using computation, how are we holding ourselves accountable to society? And just as importantly, in what ways are we giving society the capacity to call us out, to keep us from running amok, from continuing these social failures? Thank you. And with that, I look forward to the discussion.